At 83, when most people have long stepped away from the spotlight, Harrison Ford remains a name that still carries weight, mystery, and quiet authority. For decades, audiences have watched him embody some of the most iconic characters in cinematic history, from the fearless adventurer to the reluctant hero. But behind the rugged charm and stoic expressions, there has always been something more, something unspoken, something audiences felt but could never fully confirm. And now, after a lifetime of carefully guarded privacy, Harrison Ford is finally beginning to reveal what many had suspected all along. It was never about fame. From the outside, Ford's career looks like a story of extraordinary success. A man who rose from obscurity to become one of the highest-grossing actors of all time. A face that defined generations. A legacy that seems untouchable. But if you listen closely to his rare interviews, if you observe the choices he made both on and off screen, a different story begins to emerge. A story not driven by ambition in the way Hollywood understands it, but by something quieter, something deeper. Indifference to the machine. Throughout his career, Harrison Ford never played the typical Hollywood game. He avoided the spotlight when he could. He rarely attended events unless necessary. He gave interviews reluctantly, often answering questions with a kind of blunt honesty that felt almost out of place in an industry built on performance. Many once thought this was arrogance. Others thought it was just his personality. But what people are starting to realize now is that it was neither. It was intention. Ford never chased fame. He tolerated it. There is a difference, and it is one that shaped every decision he made. While others carefully curated their public image, Ford seemed almost uninterested in controlling how he was perceived. He wasn't trying to be liked. He wasn't trying to be understood. He was simply being. And that, ironically, is what made people trust him. The roles that chose him. There is a pattern in Harrison Ford's career that becomes clearer with time. He did not just play heroes. He played reluctant heroes. Men who did not seek greatness but were pulled into it. Men who doubted themselves, who resisted responsibility, who acted not out of ego but out of necessity. Think about it. These were not characters driven by glory. They were driven by survival, by loyalty, by instinct. It was never about being the center of attention. It was about doing what needed to be done. And perhaps that is why those roles felt so real, because they were not entirely fictional. A life outside the frame. While the world saw a global superstar, Harrison Ford built a life far removed from Hollywood's noise. He spent time flying planes, working with his hands, immersing himself in nature. He invested in things that had nothing to do with fame or validation. This was not an escape. It was a choice, a quiet rejection of a system that often consumes those within it. For Ford, identity was never tied to celebrity. Acting was something he did. It was not who he was. And that distinction may be the very thing that kept him grounded while others lost themselves. The silence that spoke volumes. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Harrison Ford has always been what he did not say. In an industry where oversharing is often rewarded, Ford remained guarded. He did not explain himself unnecessarily. He did not seek to clarify every misunderstanding. And in that silence, people projected their own interpretations. Some saw him as distant. Others saw him as authentic. But now, as he reflects more openly on his life and career, it becomes clear that the silence was never emptiness. It was discipline. He understood something that many never do. Not everything needs to be said to be understood. What we all suspected. For years, fans sensed that Harrison Ford was different. That behind the characters and the legacy, there was a man who did not fully belong to the world he inhabited. And now, at 83, that suspicion is no longer just a feeling. It is becoming a quiet truth. He was never trying to be a star. He was trying to live a life. A real one. One that existed beyond cameras, beyond applause, beyond expectations. And perhaps that is the most unexpected revelation of all. Because in a world obsessed with visibility, Harrison Ford found power in distance, in restraint, in choosing when to step forward and when to step away. And as more of his perspective begins to surface, it challenges something fundamental. What if success is not about being seen, What if it is about knowing when not to be? This is only the beginning of what Harrison Ford is revealing, because the deeper truth is not just about his career. It is about the cost of fame, the illusion of control, and the quiet strength it takes to remain yourself in a world that constantly tries to redefine you. Behind the image of quiet strength and effortless control, there was always another layer to Harrison Ford's story. One that never made headlines, one that did not fit the narrative of the untouchable icon. Because the truth is, the life he built came with pressures that few people could truly understand. And for a long time, he chose not to talk about it. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some things are easier carried in silence. The weight of becoming a symbol. At the height of his career, Harrison Ford was no longer just an actor. He had become something much larger. A symbol of masculinity, of resilience, of the classic hero archetype that audiences around the world admired and expected. But symbols come with a cost. They are not allowed to change too much, not allowed to break, not allowed to reveal uncertainty. And over time, that expectation begins to close in. Slowly, almost invisibly, it creates a kind of invisible cage. Ford understood this better than most. Every role he accepted, every public appearance he made, came with an unspoken pressure to remain consistent with the image people had built around him. The strong one, the steady one, the man who always seemed in control. But real life does not work that way, and neither did he. The conflict between identity and expectation. There were moments, though rarely discussed, when Harrison Ford began to feel the tension between who he was and who the world expected him to be. It was not dramatic, not explosive. It was quieter than that. A slow, persistent awareness that the image people loved was only part of the truth, and that the rest of him, the private, uncertain, evolving part, had very little space to exist in public. This is something many people never see about fame. It does not just give you visibility. It narrows you. It simplifies you into something easily understood. And once that happens, stepping outside of that identity becomes difficult, even risky. Ford's resistance to this was subtle but deliberate. He turned down roles that felt repetitive. He avoided overexposure. He stepped away when he needed to, even if it meant confusing audiences or disappointing expectations. To some, it looked like inconsistency, but in reality, it was preservation. The fear of losing something essential. One of the quiet truths that begins to emerge when looking back at Harrison Ford's life is that he was never afraid of losing fame. He was afraid of losing himself. There is a difference. Fame, for many, becomes addictive. It offers validation, attention, a sense of importance that is hard to walk away from. But Ford never fully attached his identity to it. And because of that, he was able to see its limits more clearly than most. He understood that the more you depend on external recognition, the easier it is to forget who you are without it. And that realization shaped the way he lived. He protected his time, his privacy, his sense of independence, not perfectly, not without struggle, but intentionally. The moments that changed everything. There were turning points in his life that reinforced this mindset. Injuries, close calls, personal challenges that forced him to confront his own vulnerability. Moments where the illusion of control disappeared and what remained was something far more human. These were not moments he publicized, but they mattered because they stripped away the idea that he was untouchable and replaced it with something more grounded. Awareness. Awareness of time, of fragility, of what truly holds value when everything else fades. And perhaps this is what he is beginning to reveal now, more than ever before. Not in grand statements, but in quiet reflections, a different definition of strength. For decades, people saw Harrison Ford as the embodiment of strength, physical strength, emotional control, the ability to endure without complaint. But what is becoming clearer now is that his real strength was not in what he showed. It was in what he chose not to become. He did not become consumed by fame. He did not become dependent on applause. He did not allow the industry to fully define him. And that kind of restraint is rare, especially in a world that constantly pushes for more visibility, More noise, more attention. Ford moved in the opposite direction. Less explanation. Less performance off-screen. Less need to prove anything beyond the work itself. And in doing so, he preserved something many lose along the way. Clarity. What lies beneath the silence? As he speaks more openly in recent years, there is a subtle shift in how people are beginning to understand him. The silence that once felt distant now feels intentional. The detachment that once seemed cold now feels disciplined. And the man behind the roles begins to take shape, not as a myth, but as someone who made conscious choices in a system that rarely rewards them. Someone who understood early on that the greatest risk was not failure, but becoming something you never intended to be. And that realization, more than anything else, may be what Harrison Ford is finally revealing. Not through dramatic confessions, but through perspective. A perspective shaped by decades of observation, restraint, and quiet resistance. Because in the end, the story is not just about what he achieved. It is about what he avoided, and why that may matter even more. If there is one area of Harrison Ford's life that remained even more guarded than his career, it is his relationships. Not because they lacked depth, but because they carried a complexity that fame often distorts. And over time, it became clear that the more visible his professional life became, the more carefully he protected his personal one. Because connection, unlike fame, cannot survive under constant observation. The distance success creates. As Harrison Ford's career grew, so did the distance between him and the people around him. Not intentionally, not out of neglect, but as a natural consequence of a life that no longer moved at a normal pace. Schedules became unpredictable. Expectations became heavier. Privacy became harder to maintain. And slowly, the space where real connection exists began to shrink. This is one of the quiet costs of success that few people talk about. It does not just change how the world sees you. It changes how you relate to the world. Ford experienced this in ways he rarely expressed publicly, the challenge of being present while constantly being pulled away. The difficulty of maintaining something genuine in an environment that often rewards performance over authenticity. And perhaps most importantly, the realization that not everyone around you sees you for who you are. Some see the image, some see the opportunity. Very few see the person. Learning who to trust. Over time, Harrison Ford became more selective. Not colder, not disconnected, but more aware. He understood that trust is not something that can be given freely when your life is constantly exposed to scrutiny. It has to be earned. And even then, it has to be protected. This awareness shaped the way he approached relationships. He valued honesty over admiration, simplicity over intensity, presence over attention. Because attention is easy to find, but understanding is rare. And for someone living at the level of visibility he did, that difference mattered more than anything. The sacrifices no one applauds. Behind every enduring career, there are sacrifices that never make it into interviews. Moments missed, time not recovered, relationships that slowly fade under the weight of distance and responsibility. Ford was not immune to this. Like many who dedicate themselves to their craft, he faced choices that had no perfect outcome. Choosing work often meant stepping away from personal life. Choosing privacy often meant being misunderstood. And choosing to remain true to himself sometimes meant standing apart from both. These are not dramatic sacrifices. They are quiet ones. The kind that accumulate over time. The kind that shape you without anyone noticing. And yet, they may be the most significant of all. Because they define what you are willing to lose in order to keep what matters. The illusion of connection in fame. One of the truths Harrison Ford seems to recognize more clearly now is that fame creates the illusion of connection without always providing the real thing. Millions of people feel like they know you, but very few actually do. This creates a strange paradox. You are seen by everyone, but understood by almost no one. And navigating that reality requires a level of emotional discipline that is rarely discussed. Ford managed this by maintaining boundaries, by keeping parts of himself separate from the public eye, by understanding that not everything needs to be shared to be real. In a time where oversharing is often mistaken for authenticity, this approach may seem distant. But for him, it was necessary. Because some things lose their meaning the moment they are exposed to too many perspectives. What truly matters in the end? As Harrison Ford reflects more openly at this stage of his life, there is a noticeable shift in what he emphasizes. It is no longer about achievements, not about box office numbers or iconic roles. It is about time, about the people who remained when everything else changed, about the moments that were not captured on camera, and the connections that did not depend on status. This is where his perspective becomes most revealing, because it challenges one of the most common assumptions about success, that reaching the top brings clarity. In reality, clarity often comes much later, after the noise fades, after the expectations loosen, after you begin to see your life not as a series of accomplishments, but as a series of choices. And Harrison Ford's choices, when viewed this way, begin to tell a very different story. Not of a man chasing greatness, but of a man carefully deciding what to hold on to and what to let go. The quiet truth about connection. In the end, what Harrison Ford seems to reveal is something simple, yet often overlooked. That real connection is not built through visibility. It is built through presence, through consistency, through showing up in ways that do not attract attention, but create meaning. And that kind of connection cannot be measured. It cannot be displayed. It can only be experienced, which is why it often remains invisible to the outside world. But perhaps that is exactly what makes it valuable. Because in a life surrounded by noise, expectations, and constant observation, the most meaningful things are often the ones that remain unseen and protected. As the years passed and the intensity of fame began to settle into something quieter, Harrison Ford developed a way of thinking that set him apart even more clearly from the world around him. It was not something he announced, not something he packaged into advice or philosophy. It was something you could only see if you paid attention. A pattern in how he chose, a consistency in what he refused, and a clarity that seemed to grow stronger with time. The discipline of less. In an industry built on constant expansion, more roles, more visibility, more relevance, Harrison Ford moved in the opposite direction. He did not try to be everywhere. He did not say yes to every opportunity. He did not chase the next wave of attention. He reduced, not because he lacked options, but because he understood something most people ignore. Every yes comes with a cost. And over time, too many yeses begin to take something away from you. Your focus, your identity, your ability to recognize what actually matters. Ford became increasingly selective, not just in his work, but in how he spent his energy. He chose projects that meant something to him. He walked away from things that did not, even if they promised success. To some, this looked like slowing down. But in reality, it was refinement. The ability to choose less, but better. And that is a discipline that takes time to develop. The rejection of unnecessary noise. Another pattern that becomes clear is his relationship with noise. Not just literal noise, but the constant stream of opinions, expectations, and distractions that come with public life. Harrison Ford never fully engaged with it. He did not respond to every headline. He did not explain every decision. He did not allow external narratives to dictate his internal direction. This was not indifference. It was control. Because once you begin reacting to everything around you, you lose the ability to move with intention. You become shaped by the very noise you are trying to navigate. Ford avoided that trap. He stayed focused on what was real, on the work, on his life outside of it, on the few things that actually required his attention. And by doing so, he maintained something rare: autonomy. The difference between success and fulfillment. One of the most powerful ideas that emerges from Harrison Ford's life is the distinction between success and fulfillment. To many people, they appear to be the same, but they are not. Success is external. It is measured. It is visible. It can be validated by others. Fulfillment is internal. It is quiet. It cannot be easily explained or displayed. And the two do not always align. Ford achieved success early and consistently, But instead of letting it define him, he treated it as separate from his sense of self. He did not rely on it to feel complete. This allowed him to step away when needed, to say no without fear, to prioritize things that had no public value but personal meaning. And that is where fulfillment begins. Not in what you achieve, but in what you choose to value. The courage to remain undefined. Perhaps one of the most subtle yet powerful aspects of Harrison Ford's mindset is his refusal to be fully defined. Over the years, people tried to label him the action star, the icon, the legend, but he never fully accepted any of it, because definitions, while convenient, can become limiting. The moment you accept a fixed identity, you begin to operate within its boundaries. You make decisions based on what fits the image rather than what aligns with who you are. Ford resisted that. He allowed himself to evolve, to change interests, to step into and away from roles without needing to justify it. And in doing so, he preserved something essential: freedom. The freedom to grow without permission. The freedom to exist beyond expectations. And the freedom to remain a person, not just a symbol, what he is leaving behind. Now, at 83, what Harrison Ford is revealing is not a dramatic secret or a shocking confession. It is something far more valuable: a way of living. A perspective that challenges the assumptions many people carry about success, fame, and identity. He is showing that it is possible to participate in the world without being consumed by it, to achieve without attaching your worth to achievement, to be seen without losing your sense of self, and perhaps most importantly, to step back when necessary without feeling like you are falling behind. Because not everything is meant to be chased. Some things are meant to be protected, and that includes your time, your attention, and your identity. The lesson beneath the story. If there is one lesson that quietly runs through Harrison Ford's life, it is this: you do not have to become everything the world expects of you. You can choose differently. You can define success on your own terms. You can decide what matters and what does not. And you can walk away from anything that threatens to take that away from you. This is not easy. It requires clarity. It requires discipline. And most of all, it requires the willingness to be misunderstood. But as Harrison Ford's journey shows, that may be the price of living a life that is truly your own. At a certain point in life, the focus begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The questions change. What once felt urgent no longer carries the same weight. What once seemed distant becomes immediate. And the idea of legacy, something that once belonged to the future, begins to feel personal. For Harrison Ford, this shift did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as awareness. The awareness of time, not as something infinite, but as something increasingly precise, measured not in years ahead, but in moments that matter now, in choices that can no longer be postponed, in priorities that can no longer be ignored. And with that awareness comes clarity. Not about everything, but about what truly remains, the illusion of forever. For most of his life, time was something that worked in the background. There was always another project, another opportunity, another chapter waiting to unfold. The pace of success creates the illusion that there will always be more. More time, more chances, more moments to get things right. But that illusion does not last forever. And when it fades, what replaces it is not fear. It is focus. Harrison Ford seems to understand this now more than ever. Not in a way that is heavy or regretful, but in a way that is grounded, intentional, clear. He no longer moves as someone chasing what is next. He moves as someone choosing what is worth it. And that distinction changes everything. What legacy really means. For many, legacy is tied to achievements, awards, recognition, the things that can be remembered and repeated long after they are gone. But that is only one layer, and perhaps not the most important one, because the deeper layer of legacy is not what people remember about you. It is what remains because of you, the impact on people, the values that continue, the quiet influence that does not need to be announced to be real. Ford's legacy, when viewed this way, is not just the characters he played or the films he helped define. It is the way he navigated a world that often pulls people away from themselves, and how he managed, despite everything, to stay anchored. That is not something you can measure, but it is something people feel. The final refinement. There is a certain refinement that happens with time, a stripping away of what is unnecessary, a clearer understanding of what deserves attention and what does not. Harrison Ford's life reflects this. He speaks less, but says more. He does less, but chooses better. He engages selectively, not out of distance, but out of clarity. This is not withdrawal. It is precision. Because when time becomes more visible, you begin to treat it differently. You begin to see that not everything deserves your energy, not every opportunity deserves your response, and not every path deserves to be followed, even if it leads somewhere impressive. This is where wisdom begins to take shape, not in knowing everything, but in knowing what to leave behind. The message beneath everything. If there is a message that Harrison Ford seems to be leaving behind, it is not delivered directly. It is not framed as advice. It is not presented as something to follow. It is simply there, in the way he lived. A quiet understanding that you are not here to become everything. You are here to become something real. And that requires choices. Difficult ones. The kind that may not always make sense to others. The kind that may not bring immediate reward. But the kind that allow you to look at your life, not as a performance, but as something authentic. Something that belongs to you, not to the world. The truth about the end. There is a certain honesty that comes with the later stages of life, a perspective that cannot be rushed, cannot be taught, cannot be borrowed, only experienced. And what Harrison Ford seems to reveal, more than anything else, is that the end is not something to fear. It is something that clarifies. It removes the unnecessary. It brings forward what was always important, but often overlooked. And it leaves you with a simple question. What was all of this for? Not in a dramatic sense, but in a deeply personal one. And the answer, if lived well, is not found in what you achieved, but in how you lived while achieving it. In the end, after decades of success, silence, resistance, and quiet reflection, what Harrison Ford reveals is not a secret in the way people expected. There is no shocking confession, no hidden scandal, no dramatic twist that changes everything. Instead, what emerges is something far more unsettling, because it is simple. And simplicity, when it carries truth, has a way of confronting everything we believe, the realization that changes everything. After a lifetime spent navigating fame without fully surrendering to it, Harrison Ford seems to arrive at a realization that reframes his entire journey. That none of it was ever meant to define him. Not the success, not the recognition, not even the legacy. Because all of those things exist outside of you. They are reflections, not substance. And if you are not careful, you begin to confuse the two. You begin to build your identity around what is seen, rather than what is real. Ford never fully made that mistake. And that may be the most important thing he is now revealing. That the world will always try to tell you who you are. But it is your responsibility to decide whether to believe it. The quiet power of detachment. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Harrison Ford has always been his detachment. For years, people interpreted it as distance, disinterest, even coldness. But looking back now, it becomes clear that it was something else. It was protection. Detachment, in his case, was not about disconnecting from life. It was about refusing to be controlled by things that do not last. Fame fades. Attention shifts. Public opinion changes without warning. And if your sense of self is tied to any of those things, you will always feel unstable. Ford chose a different approach. He stayed involved, but not attached. He participated, but did not depend. He succeeded, but did not become consumed. And that balance is what allowed him to endure, not just as an actor, but as a person. What most people get wrong. There is a common belief that reaching a certain level of success will bring clarity, that once you achieve enough, you will finally understand what matters. But Harrison Ford's life suggests the opposite. Clarity does not come from having more. It comes from needing less. Less validation, less approval, less noise. And when you remove those things, what remains is not emptiness. It is truth. The truth about what you value. The truth about who you are when no one is watching. And the truth about whether the life you built actually belongs to you. This is not something success automatically gives you. It is something you have to choose. Again and again. The final perspective. At 83, what Harrison Ford offers is not advice in the traditional sense. He is not telling people what to do. He is not presenting a formula. He is showing something. Through the way he lived, through what he accepted, and through what he refused. He is showing that it is possible to move through a world that constantly demands more from you without losing the ability to choose for yourself, to define your own limits, to protect your own identity, and to step away when necessary without feeling like you are losing something. Because sometimes stepping away is the only way to keep what matters. The one truth that remains. If everything in Harrison Ford's journey could be reduced to a single truth, it might be this. You are not what you achieve. You are what you refuse to become. And that distinction is everything. Because achievements can be taken away. They can fade. They can be replaced by something newer, something louder, something more relevant. But what you refuse, what you protect, what you choose not to sacrifice, that stays. That defines the shape of your life, not in the eyes of the world, but in the reality you live every day. And perhaps that is the final revelation. Not something hidden, not something dramatic, but something that was always there, quiet, consistent, unshaken. That a meaningful life is not built by chasing everything. It is built by choosing carefully and having the strength to stand by those choices even when no one else understands them. In the end, what makes Harrison Ford's story resonate is not the scale of his success, but the restraint within it. Not the roles he accepted, but the ones he walked away from. Not the attention he received, but the distance he maintained from it. Because when everything is stripped away, what remains is not the image. It is the pattern. The pattern of a man who moved through one of the loudest industries in the world without becoming loud himself, who carried recognition without letting it reshape his identity, who understood, perhaps earlier than most, that the greatest risk was never failure. It was forgetting who you were, the impact that cannot be seen. There are legacies that are easy to measure, awards, records, cultural milestones that can be pointed to and remembered. Harrison Ford has all of those, but the deeper impact of his life exists somewhere else, in the quiet influence he leaves behind, in the people who observe his path and begin to question their own, in the subtle shift that happens when someone realizes that success does not have to look the way it has always been presented, because influence is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet permission. Permission to slow down, permission to choose differently, permission to not become everything the world expects. And that kind of influence often lasts longer than anything else. Why his story matters now. There is a reason this perspective feels more relevant today than ever before. Because the world has become louder, faster, more demanding. There is constant pressure to be visible, to be active, to be validated, to prove over and over again that you are moving forward, that you are achieving, that you are keeping up. And in that environment, it becomes easy to lose direction, easy to confuse movement with progress, easy to trade meaning for momentum. Harrison Ford's story stands in contrast to that. It reminds people that it is possible to step outside of that cycle, to define progress in a way that is not dependent on constant visibility, to build something real, even if it is not always seen. And that reminder may be more valuable now than ever. The quiet ending that says everything. There is something fitting about the way Harrison Ford's story unfolds at this stage of his life. There is no dramatic conclusion, no final performance meant to summarize everything, just a gradual shift. a quieter presence, a stronger clarity, and a sense that nothing needs to be proven anymore. Because in the end, the need to prove is what drives most people away from themselves. And the absence of that need is what brings them back. Ford no longer moves with urgency. He moves with certainty. Not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about what matters. And that is a different kind of confidence. One that does not require validation. One that does not depend on recognition. One that simply exists. The final realization. If there is one final realization that emerges from everything Harrison Ford has revealed, it is this: that a life well lived is not one that captures the most attention. It is one that remains intact. Intact in its values, intact in its direction, intact in its sense of self, even as everything around it changes. Because the world will always change. Expectations will shift, standards will evolve, and the noise will continue. But if you can move through all of that without losing your center, then you have done something far more difficult than success. You have remained whole, and that may be the most important achievement of all. Not the one people celebrate, but the one that stays with you long after everything else fades. This is what Harrison Ford finally reveals. Not a secret, but a truth. That in a world constantly asking you to become more, the real power lies in knowing what not to become, and having the strength to live by it.